in the dense forests and rolling hills of what is now upstate New York. Long before the arrival of European settlers, a political and social order flourished that would challenge the very assumptions upon which much of modern American history has been constructed. This was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often referred to in English as the Iroquois League, a union of 5 and later 6 nations whose governance, diplomacy, and law demonstrated a sophistication that rivaled the political structures of Europe. At a time when most European observers assumed that democracy was a product of Greek thought or British precedent, the Haudenosaunee had already established a complex system designed to maintain peace, regulate conflict, and secure the welfare of multiple peoples under a shared framework of law and custom. It is in this overlooked tradition that we find the seeds of ideas that would later echo through the debates of the American founding, though their contributions have often been obscured by centuries of narrative omission. The Confederacy itself was not a casual alliance, but a carefully articulated political system designed to endure. 5 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, came together under what they called the Great Law of Peace. Each nation maintained its own leadership, customs, and territories, yet they operated collectively, making decisions that balanced the authority of the group with the autonomy of each member. In a world dominated by hierarchical monarchies and emerging nation-states, this approach represented a striking alternative, a model where consensus, debate, and the rule of law formed the foundation of governance. Unlike European states where kings or parliaments often dictated policy with limited input from the general populace, the Haudenosaunee placed councils at the center of political life. These councils, composed of clan leaders chosen by the people, deliberated on matters of war, diplomacy, trade, and internal disputes, adhering to a procedural rigor that ensured all voices, at least within the governing elite, were heard. The sophistication of the Haudenosaunee system was not limited to its structural design. It was also embedded in its philosophy. The Great Law of Peace, as it was called, codified principles of fairness, responsibility, and collective welfare. It offered mechanisms to resolve conflicts without recourse to violence, set standards for leadership and accountability, and emphasized the interdependence of communities. Leadership was understood not as a personal right or privilege, but as a role of service, with chiefs responsible for representing their clans and nations in ways that honored collective consensus. Those who failed in their duties could be removed, and councils maintained the authority to mediate and adjudicate disputes, ensuring that no single voice could dominate unchecked. This system demanded negotiation, patience, and a commitment to shared values. A political culture strikingly different from the competitive, often zero-sum contests familiar to European settlers. When Europeans arrived, they encountered a political landscape that defied their expectations. Early colonists often described the Haudenosaunee with a mixture of admiration, confusion, and condescension, struggling to reconcile their own assumptions about what constituted civilized governance with the evident order and effectiveness of the League. While European observers were accustomed to hereditary kingships, rigid social hierarchies, and centralized power, the Haudenosaunee demonstrated that unity could be maintained through distributed authority, deliberative councils, and cultural norms rather than coercion. In many ways, the first encounters between these societies were not simply meetings of peoples, but meetings of political philosophies, one rooted in long-standing European traditions of monarchy and property, the other grounded in collective responsibility, intergenerational memory, and negotiated compromise. It is in these encounters that the potential for influence, subtle though it may have been, begins to emerge. Figures such as Benjamin Franklin, who would later play a crucial role in the founding of the United States, were attentive to the organizational capabilities of the Haudenosaunee. Franklin noted their ability to maintain cohesion among multiple semi-autonomous nations and admired the mechanisms through which disputes were resolved without escalating to warfare. The League's model provided a living example of political unity achieved not through force, but through law, deliberation, and shared commitment. A lesson that was both practical and conceptual. Yet this acknowledgement was never straightforward or consistent. The admiration existed alongside prevailing Eurocentric assumptions, creating a tension in which the political sophistication of indigenous governance was recognized but rarely credited explicitly in subsequent historical narratives. To understand the significance of this system, one must appreciate the historical and environmental context in which it developed. The Haudenosaunee were not merely political actors. They were also stewards of the land, navigators of complex ecological systems, and participants in extensive trade networks. Their governance structures evolved to mediate not only human conflicts but also interactions with neighboring nations, the rhythms of seasonal cycles, and the demands of survival in a challenging environment. Councils were not abstract institutions. They were practical tools for coordinating agricultural production, hunting expeditions, and defensive strategies, all of which required cooperation across clans and nations. The enduring stability of the Confederacy over centuries is a testament to the effectiveness of these mechanisms. Yet despite this resilience, the story of the Haudenosaunee has often been marginalized in the broader narrative of North American history. When the story of democracy in the United States is told, the emphasis overwhelmingly falls on European intellectual traditions, Enlightenment philosophy, and colonial experiments in self-governance. The Haudenosaunee are frequently relegated to a peripheral role, their sophisticated institutions reduced to footnotes or anecdotes. This omission is not merely an accident of historiography. It reflects a broader pattern in which the contributions of indigenous peoples were systematically undervalued as the new nation sought to construct a cohesive identity rooted in European models. By centering their story, however, one uncovers a layer of history that is not only compelling but essential for understanding the origins of American political thought. The task of revealing this history requires careful attention to the evidence. Oral traditions, treaty records, colonial correspondence, and early writings by figures such as Franklin and John Adams provide glimpses into the influence of the Haudenosaunee system. These sources reveal that colonial leaders were aware, to varying degrees, of the practical lessons offered by the League, the necessity of intercolonial cooperation, the value of shared law, and the ways in which a decentralized yet cohesive union could function effectively. While the transmission of ideas was indirect and often filtered through the lens of European assumptions, the structural parallels between the Confederacy and later American governance structures suggest a form of intellectual osmosis that is rarely acknowledged in conventional accounts. Even more compelling is the moral and philosophical resonance of the Great Law of Peace. Unlike European systems that frequently relied on coercion or privilege, the Haudenosaunee framework emphasized dialogue, responsibility, and accountability. Leaders were expected to serve the collective interest, respect the counsel of others, and act as custodians rather than proprietors of power. In a sense, the Confederacy offered a proof of concept. It demonstrated that complex societies could achieve order and cohesion through law, reasoned debate, and shared values rather than through hierarchical imposition. This principle, subtly absorbed by colonial thinkers, would later surface in discussions of federalism, checks and balances, and the distribution of authority across states and institutions. At the heart of this history lies a paradox. The Haudenosaunee were both influential and largely invisible in the American imagination. Their political genius shaped the intellectual environment of the colonies, yet the narrative of the nation's founding has often cast them as peripheral, exoticized, or even absent. To tell this story fully is to confront that paradox, to acknowledge that the history of democracy in North America is not a linear inheritance from Europe, but a tapestry woven from multiple sources, including indigenous governance systems that have long mastered the art of political balance, consensus, and unity. As this chapter concludes, the viewer is invited to reconsider the origins of political ideas often taken for granted. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was not an isolated curiosity, but a functioning, adaptable, and durable political entity whose principles resonated far beyond the forests of the northeastern woodlands. By situating the Confederacy at the center of this narrative, one begins to see American democracy not as a sudden emergence of Enlightenment thought on a blank canvas, but as a synthesis of multiple traditions, experiences, and innovations. The great law of peace, the councils, the responsibilities of leaders, and the careful attention to unity and autonomy. All these elements provide context that illuminates the choices and challenges faced by colonial thinkers and, eventually, the framers of the Constitution. Ultimately, this opening chapter establishes the central premise. To understand the origins of American democracy fully, one must first acknowledge a story that has too often been overlooked. It requires seeing the Haudenosaunee not as a historical footnote, but as architects of a political system that prefigured many of the debates and structures central to the United States. Their story sets the stage for a deeper exploration of influence, adaptation, and erasure, and it challenges the audience to confront the complexity of history, where ideas travel, cross-pollinate, and leave legacies that are felt even when they are not explicitly recognized. By beginning here, in the forests and councils of the Haudenosaunee, we lay the groundwork for understanding a history that is both profound and, until recently, hidden from view. Long before the colonies faced the challenge of uniting disparate territories under a single political vision, the Haudenosaunee had already confronted a similar task and accomplished it with remarkable skill. The Confederacy was not an abstract or symbolic association. It was a living, functioning union of distinct nations, each with its own customs, territories, and leadership structures. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, the original 5 nations, recognized that survival and prosperity depended upon unity. Yet this unity was not achieved through coercion or conquest. It was the product of negotiation, shared values, and a deliberate commitment to collective governance. From the earliest formation of the League, the leaders of these nations understood that maintaining balance among autonomous actors required both structure and flexibility, rules and empathy, authority and accountability. The Onondaga, situated at the geographic heart of the Confederacy, played a unique role as keepers of the council fire, the symbolic and practical center of decision-making. It was here that representatives of each nation gathered to deliberate, debate, and decide matters of common concern. The council was not merely ceremonial. It was a site where ideas were contested, agreements forged, and compromises reached. Decisions were rarely rushed. Each clan was represented by multiple sachems, chosen through a system that emphasized both experience and community approval, ensuring that no single perspective dominated. This structure fostered a culture in which negotiation was expected, dissent was considered legitimate, and consensus was the ultimate measure of legitimacy. Unlike European parliaments or royal courts, where debate could be curtailed by hierarchy or privilege, the Haudenosaunee councils operated on principles designed to cultivate dialogue and deliberate reflection, recognizing that the endurance of the Union depended on the satisfaction of all its members. At the same time, the League maintained a clear hierarchy of responsibility that allowed for coordinated action when necessary. While decisions were collectively made, the councils could direct matters of diplomacy, trade, or military response with efficiency. Leadership was both functional and symbolic. Chiefs did not possess power by virtue of birth alone. Their authority was earned, maintained, and subject to ongoing review. They were expected to embody the values of the great law of peace, advocating for their people while acting in the interest of the Confederacy as a whole. When a leader failed to meet these responsibilities, removal was possible, demonstrating a level of accountability rarely matched in contemporary European polities. This balance between autonomy and unity, between deliberation and action, was the defining feature of Haudenosaunee governance and the foundation upon which its stability rested. The Confederacy's structure was inherently federal in nature, though it predated European notions of federalism by centuries. Each nation retained its sovereignty, managing internal affairs, land allocation, and clan relations according to local customs. Yet in matters that transcended individual territories, such as internation disputes, collective defense, or foreign diplomacy, The League functioned as a unified actor. This duality allowed the Confederacy to adapt, survive, and project influence without requiring homogenization or the suppression of diversity. It also demanded extraordinary skill in mediation, diplomacy, and strategic planning. Leaders were trained to listen as carefully as they spoke, to weigh the interests of neighbors as conscientiously as those of their own people, and to frame decisions in terms of long-term stability rather than short-term advantage. One of the Confederacy's most remarkable achievements was its ability to maintain cohesion over generations. Unlike European monarchies, where dynastic succession could provoke internecine conflict, the Haudenosaunee relied on a system of matrilineal inheritance that empowered women to select and, when necessary, depose leaders. Clan mothers, who carried both authority and responsibility, ensured that leaders reflected the values of their people and maintained the trust of the community. This system of checks and balances created a remarkable continuity of governance, allowing the League to endure environmental challenges, intertribal conflicts, and the increasing pressures of European colonization. It was a living example of institutional resilience, demonstrating that political longevity could be achieved through distributed authority and participatory oversight rather than through coercion or the concentration of power. The internal mechanisms of the Confederacy were mirrored by its external strategies. The Haudenosaunee were deeply engaged in diplomacy, not as a reactive measure, but as a proactive instrument of survival and influence. Their councils deliberated on treaties, alliances, and conflicts with neighboring nations and European settlers alike, always with an eye toward maintaining sovereignty and equilibrium. Trade networks spanned vast distances, connecting the Confederacy to other indigenous nations and, increasingly, to colonial economies. Diplomacy, warfare, and trade were all mediated by the principles of the Great Law, which emphasized fairness, reciprocity, and foresight. This approach allowed the Haudenosaunee to exercise considerable influence, shaping regional dynamics and compelling European powers to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate and formidable political entity. Colonial observers, when they paused to understand, often marveled at this system. They noted that the Haudenosaunee could mobilize collective action without resorting to coercion, resolve disputes through negotiation rather than violence, and maintain alliances across diverse and sometimes competing interests. Figures like Benjamin Franklin, whose later writings would hint at an admiration for indigenous political systems, recognized the practical lessons inherent in the League's design. The ability to reconcile autonomy with collective responsibility, to balance local priorities with regional cohesion, and to sustain an enduring social contract across generations was a political achievement that few European models could rival at the time. Yet, as with much of indigenous history, this knowledge was filtered, interpreted, and often minimized in European accounts, leaving the subtler influences obscured while the visible cultural trappings were highlighted or misunderstood. The Confederacy's longevity was reinforced by its capacity for conflict resolution. Disputes within and between nations were inevitable. Yet the League's institutions ensured that disagreement rarely escalated into open warfare. Mediation processes, councils, and structured debate allowed grievances to be aired, assessed, and addressed in ways that strengthened, rather than weakened, collective bonds. The emphasis on dialogue over coercion, consensus over domination, and accountability over unchecked authority fostered a political culture that prized stability, trust, and foresight. It was a system that required patience and respect for procedure, cultivating leaders who understood that power was responsibility and that decisions must serve the long-term welfare of multiple communities. Another defining aspect of the Confederacy was its adaptability. While the League rested on centuries-old traditions, it was not rigid. The inclusion of the Tuscarora as the sixth nation in the early 18th century illustrates a capacity for expansion, integration, and institutional flexibility. New members were incorporated through negotiation and consensus, extending the Confederacy's influence without undermining its foundational principles. This adaptability ensured that the League could respond to demographic changes, environmental pressures, and the evolving landscape of colonial encroachment, maintaining relevance and cohesion even in times of significant challenge. Understanding the Haudenosaunee Confederacy requires seeing it as both a political achievement and a social project. Governance was inseparable from culture, morality, and identity. Decisions were informed not only by strategic necessity, but also by shared ethical frameworks embedded in oral traditions, ceremonies, and collective memory. Leaders were accountable not only to immediate constituents, but to past generations and to future ones, creating a temporal depth to governance that reinforced the weight and significance of each decision. Law, diplomacy, and leadership were all interwoven with cultural values, producing a system in which political and social stability were mutually reinforcing rather than independent. As the colonies began to struggle with the question of unity, particularly in the decades leading to revolution, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy offered a living example of a solution that combined local autonomy with collective governance. Their experience illustrated that it was possible to respect diversity while achieving cohesion, to delegate authority while maintaining accountability, and to sustain institutions over generations without resorting to coercion. This was not a simple lesson, and its influence was subtle, filtered through observation, correspondence, and reflection, yet its presence in the intellectual environment of the colonies was real. The Confederacy's political logic was a counterpoint to the hierarchical models familiar to European settlers and offered practical insights into the possibilities and challenges of union. In this chapter, the viewer is asked to recognize the depth of this achievement. The Haudenosaunee were not merely an indigenous society navigating the pressures of colonization. They were architects of a sophisticated political union whose principles resonated across decades and borders. Their councils, clan systems, conflict resolution mechanisms, and flexible yet durable governance structures provided a framework of unity that was both functional and morally grounded. By examining the Confederacy in detail, one begins to see the ways in which indigenous governance influenced, intentionally or indirectly, the emerging political consciousness of the colonies, offering lessons in unity, responsibility, and collective problem-solving that were later mirrored, imperfectly but significantly, in the formation of the United States. Ultimately, the story of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is a story of foresight, deliberation, and enduring design. It reveals a people who understood that survival depended on collaboration, that leadership demanded accountability, and that unity was achieved not through domination, but through negotiation, shared values, and institutional resilience. By appreciating the Confederacy's sophistication, one gains a deeper understanding of the broader currents that shaped North American political development and begins to challenge the conventional narrative that locates the origins of democracy solely in European thought. The Haudenosaunee offer an alternative, compelling model, one rooted in centuries of lived experience, moral reflection, and collective intelligence, a model whose lessons echo far beyond the forests in which they first took shape. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy's cohesion and longevity rested not merely on councils, ceremonies, or the careful distribution of authority, but on a philosophical and legal foundation so sophisticated that it continues to fascinate historians and political thinkers today. This foundation, known as the Great Law of Peace, was far more than a set of rules. It was a living constitution, a moral compass, and a social contract intertwined with the spiritual and cultural life of the nations. Its principles guided leaders, shaped communities, and established norms that regulated not only the exercise of power, but the very relationships between human beings, their leaders, and the natural world. To understand the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, one must first appreciate that this law was not imposed from above or codified as abstract text, but transmitted through oral tradition, ceremony, and communal practice, internalized by generations of people who understood that the stability of the whole depended upon the integrity of the parts. The Great Law of Peace codified ideas that modern political theorists would recognize as essential to sustainable governance. It emphasized the balance between individual responsibility and collective welfare, the necessity of consultation, and the moral obligations of leaders toward their constituents. Chiefs were not rulers in the European sense. They were representatives, entrusted with authority, but accountable to the people and bound by the ethical imperatives of the law. Leadership required patience, wisdom, and a deep understanding of the consequences of action. It demanded that those in power act with restraint, prioritize consensus, and consider the long-term welfare of the Confederacy over personal gain or clan advantage. In practice, this meant that political debate was vigorous but bounded by mutual respect, and that decisions were made with an awareness of precedent, principle, and the broader social fabric. One of the central features of the Great Law of Peace was its insistence on mediation and conflict resolution. Disputes between clans, nations, or individual members were inevitable, yet the law provided structured mechanisms to resolve them without resorting to violence. Councils served as forums for airing grievances, negotiating settlements, and restoring harmony, often involving ritualized procedures that reinforced both fairness and accountability. The law recognized that human relationships were fragile and that social cohesion required careful maintenance. By embedding conflict resolution within the very framework of governance, the Haudenosaunee ensured that disputes became opportunities for reflection, dialogue, and reinforcement of collective values rather than destructive ruptures. Equally important was the law's articulation of leadership responsibilities. Chiefs were selected based on merit, community trust, and demonstrated adherence to the principles of the Great Law, often through the endorsement of clan mothers. Their authority was conditional, contingent upon ethical conduct, and subject to revocation if they acted contrary to the welfare of their people or the Confederacy as a whole. This system of checks and balances was remarkably sophisticated, providing both stability and flexibility. It ensured that leaders were capable of guiding the Confederacy through crises while remaining accountable to the people they represented. In this sense, the law functioned as a moral and political instrument, embedding ethical constraints directly into the mechanics of governance. The Great Law of Peace also extended beyond internal political relations to encompass the Confederacy's interactions with outsiders. Diplomacy, trade, and even warfare were regulated by principles of justice, reciprocity, and foresight. Treaties were treated with solemnity. Negotiation was conducted with transparency and deliberation, and promises were binding not merely as legal obligations, but as moral imperatives. The law recognized that the Confederacy's survival depended on both internal cohesion and external credibility, and it provided guidelines for ensuring that the Confederacy could maintain influence and stability across a complex and often volatile landscape. European observers, when they attempted to comprehend these practices, often noted the remarkable restraint, foresight, and ethical rigor with which the Haudenosaunee conducted their affairs, though such observations were rarely integrated into the emerging narrative of American political thought. A striking feature of the Great Law of Peace was its emphasis on education and intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Young people were taught the principles of governance, law, and social responsibility from an early age, not in abstract lectures, but through participation in councils, observation of ceremonial practices, and mentorship by elders. This continuous cultivation of civic understanding ensured that the Confederacy's principles were internalized, not merely memorized, creating a citizenry capable of thoughtful participation in public life. Knowledge of the law was intertwined with identity, memory, and spiritual practice, reinforcing both social cohesion and cultural continuity. Leadership, therefore, was inseparable from learning, and authority was inseparable from ethical practice, a combination that modern scholars often recognize as a hallmark of enduring political systems. The law also codified protections for diversity within the Confederacy. While the League functioned as a single political entity, it recognized the sovereignty and distinct customs of each nation. Decisions were made with consideration for local practices, and policies that threatened autonomy or cultural integrity were carefully negotiated. In this way, The Great Law of Peace created a framework in which pluralism was not merely tolerated but institutionalized. The Confederacy's stability depended on its ability to harmonize difference, balancing unity and diversity in a manner that ensured both cohesion and resilience. This principle of balancing local autonomy with collective responsibility would later resonate, in subtle and indirect ways, in the federal structure of the United States, even as the indigenous contributions to that structure were obscured in mainstream historical narratives. Another essential aspect of the law was its insistence on accountability through ceremony and symbolic practice. Councils and decisions were embedded in ritualized procedures that emphasized transparency, collective memory, and ethical reflection. Speeches, stories, and symbols served not merely as cultural expression, but as tools of governance, reminding leaders and citizens alike of their obligations and the consequences of their choices. This integration of ethics, ritual, and politics reinforced a sense of shared responsibility, ensuring that the Confederacy's laws were lived and experienced rather than simply codified or abstracted. The law, in this sense, functioned as both guide and guardian, shaping behavior, preserving social order, and sustaining legitimacy across generations. The intellectual sophistication of the Great Law of Peace extended to its understanding of human nature and the dynamics of power. It recognized that ambition, competition, and conflict were inherent in social life, and it provided mechanisms to channel these forces constructively. Leaders were expected to negotiate, compromise, and defer to collective judgment when necessary. Disputes were reframed as opportunities to reinforce cohesion rather than occasions for domination or revenge. In doing so, the law created a culture in which authority was exercised responsibly, dissent was managed ethically, and the unity of the Confederacy was preserved without suppressing individual or communal interests. This understanding of governance as a moral, practical, and relational enterprise was arguably one of the most advanced political philosophies of the era. The Great Law of Peace also offered a vision of governance that was proactive rather than reactive. It anticipated challenges, interclan disputes, external threats, ecological pressures, and provided principles for addressing them before they escalated. Its rules were flexible enough to accommodate unforeseen circumstances while remaining anchored in enduring values. This balance of stability and adaptability ensured that the Confederacy could survive centuries of change, from environmental shifts to the arrival of European settlers, without sacrificing its core principles or fracturing under internal strain. It was a testament to foresight, prudence, and ethical rigor in political design. In practical terms, the law enabled the Confederacy to achieve remarkable feats of coordination. Decisions regarding war, alliances, trade, and diplomacy were informed by collective deliberation and ethical calculation. Leaders convened to assess risks, weigh consequences, and project the needs of multiple nations across time. This structured approach allowed the Haudenosaunee to maintain unity during periods of external pressure, resist domination by neighboring powers, and negotiate treaties that reflected both prudence and principle. The law created a system in which action was deliberate, consequences were considered, and governance was inseparable from morality. As colonial observers like Franklin and other intellectuals would note decades later, the Haudenosaunee offered a working model of unity achieved without coercion, leadership tempered by accountability, and law embedded in culture. The Great Law of Peace demonstrated that democracy, consensus, and ethical governance were not merely European inventions, but could emerge from diverse traditions, grounded in lived experience and social necessity. Its influence, though subtle and often unacknowledged, shaped the intellectual landscape in which colonial leaders began to grapple with the question of how to unite separate colonies into a coherent political entity. The principles of deliberation, accountability, and shared responsibility were absorbed, adapted, and in some cases mirrored in the debates that would eventually lead to the formation of the United States, even as the original source of these ideas remained largely invisible in dominant historical narratives. Ultimately, the Great Law of Peace represents more than a legal code. It is a philosophical vision, a moral compass, and a practical guide for governance. It integrates ethics, politics, culture, and spirituality into a coherent framework that guided the Haudenosaunee for centuries. It shows that unity can be achieved through deliberation rather than coercion, that leadership is a responsibility rather than a privilege, and that law can be both enduring and adaptable. By examining the Great Law of Peace, one begins to see how the Confederacy's achievements were not accidental, but the result of deliberate, principled design, a political system whose influence would ripple far beyond its immediate geography, leaving traces in the intellectual and practical evolution of American democracy. The story of the Haudenosaunee and the Great Law of Peace challenges conventional historical narratives, inviting a reconsideration of what democracy is and where it comes from. It reminds us that political genius is not the monopoly of one culture or tradition, and that the principles of justice, deliberation, and collective responsibility can emerge in diverse contexts. In doing so, it sets the stage for a deeper understanding of the interactions between indigenous governance and colonial thought, offering insight into the ways in which ideas travel, transform, and shape societies even when their origins are not fully acknowledged. By centering the Great Law of Peace, we begin to recognize a hidden architecture of political thought that predates, informs, and complicates the familiar story of American democracy. The governance of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was distinguished not only by its structures, but by the principles that guided those who held leadership positions. Chiefs were expected to embody the values of the Great Law of Peace in every action, and their authority was inseparable from their moral conduct and commitment to the welfare of the people. Unlike European monarchs, whose power was often inherited or justified by divine right, the Haudenosaunee operated under a system that treated leadership as a sacred trust rather than a personal privilege. A chief could be elevated by the people, but that elevation carried with it a profound responsibility to speak for the community, protect its interests, and navigate both internal and external challenges with integrity. This understanding of leadership was rooted in centuries of experience and reflected a deep awareness that political authority, when exercised without accountability, could erode the social fabric. The selection of chiefs was a careful and deliberate process, guided by both matrilineal inheritance and community assessment. Clan mothers played a central role in this process, possessing the authority to nominate candidates, endorse their leadership, and, if necessary, remove them from office. This system ensured that leaders were deeply connected to their communities and constantly evaluated based on their performance, wisdom, and ethical behavior. Leadership was not static. It was conditional upon ongoing adherence to the values of the Confederacy. If a chief acted in ways that undermined unity, violated the trust of the people, or disregarded the principles of the Great Law, they could be deposed. This mechanism of accountability created a dynamic political culture in which authority was always coupled with responsibility, and power was exercised in service rather than for personal gain. Councils were the arenas in which leadership was tested, refined, and enacted. They were not simply forums for discussion, but spaces where the legitimacy of decisions and the character of leaders were continuously assessed. Each nation sent representatives, often multiple sachems, to deliberate on matters of war, trade, diplomacy, and domestic policy. These councils operated on principles of deliberation, debate, and consensus. Arguments were weighed carefully, the needs of each nation considered, and solutions crafted that would balance the collective interest with local autonomy. In this sense, councils were both practical and moral institutions. They produced decisions that were functional while also reinforcing the ethical framework that sustained the Confederacy. Leaders were expected not only to persuade but to listen, to negotiate, and to act in ways that reflected both prudence and integrity. The authority of chiefs was therefore exercised within a lattice of obligations and constraints. Unlike rulers who could act unilaterally, Haudenosaunee leaders were subject to constant oversight. Their words and actions were observed by clan mothers, council members, and the broader community, and any breach of trust could result in removal. This system created a profound alignment between power and accountability, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of governance that prefigured concepts later formalized in European political thought, such as checks and balances and the rule of law. The Confederacy's approach was neither theoretical nor abstract. It was embedded in daily practice, oral tradition, and communal expectation, producing a political culture in which ethical leadership was both a requirement and a measure of legitimacy. Beyond the mechanics of governance, the role of chiefs was deeply intertwined with diplomacy and external relations. The Haudenosaunee engaged with neighboring indigenous nations and, increasingly, with European settlers and colonial governments. Chiefs were not simply domestic administrators. They were emissaries, negotiators, and strategists who carried the weight of their people's reputation and security into every interaction. Treaties, trade agreements, and negotiations over land or alliance were approached with a combination of prudence, foresight, and moral reflection, guided by the great law of peace. Leaders understood that their decisions had consequences not only for the present but for generations to come, and that maintaining credibility and trust was as important as any material or strategic gain. In this way, leadership extended beyond the immediate scope of authority and encompassed both temporal and ethical dimensions. Leadership within the Confederacy was also profoundly relational. Chiefs were expected to cultivate strong connections with other leaders, mediators, and advisors, understanding that unity required collaboration and mutual respect. Decisions were rarely imposed. They were negotiated, deliberated, and collectively endorsed. The emphasis on dialogue created a political environment in which persuasion and reasoning were more valuable than coercion or force. This relational approach extended to the people as well. Leaders were accountable not only to their councils but to the communities they represented. By embedding accountability at every level, the Haudenosaunee ensured that governance was participatory, responsive, and resilient. A critical element of this leadership model was the integration of ethics, culture, and ceremony into the exercise of authority. Chiefs did not govern in isolation from social norms. Their decisions were reinforced by ritual, storytelling, and public reflection. Ceremonies provided opportunities to reaffirm collective values, educate the young, and remind leaders of their obligations. These practices strengthened both the legitimacy of decisions and the cohesion of the community, demonstrating that governance in the Haudenosaunee context was as much a moral and cultural practice as it was a political one. The fusion of ethics and authority created a governance system that was adaptive, enduring, and deeply respected by its members. Conflict management was another defining responsibility of leaders. Disputes within nations or between nations were inevitable, yet the Confederacy's systems allowed these disputes to be addressed constructively. Chiefs mediated tensions, facilitated negotiations, and ensured that outcomes adhered to the principles of the great law of peace. In this way, leadership was inseparable from the maintenance of social order. The authority of chiefs derived not from coercive power, but from their ability to sustain trust, fairness, and stability across complex social networks. The Confederacy's resilience, in large part, was the result of this ethical and procedural rigor, which allowed it to withstand internal and external pressures over centuries. The integration of women into governance, particularly through the role of clan mothers, reinforced the ethical dimensions of leadership. Clan mothers were not passive figures. They wielded significant authority in selecting, guiding, and, when necessary, removing chiefs. Their involvement ensured that leadership remained accountable, that the voices of the community were represented, and that power could not become concentrated or self-serving. This system created a balance of gendered authority that was rare for the time and demonstrated a nuanced understanding of social equilibrium and political stability. By embedding oversight and guidance across multiple levels of society, the Confederacy produced a governance model that was resilient, adaptable, and ethically coherent. Leaders were also custodians of memory and tradition. They carried the responsibility of transmitting the principles of the great law of peace to younger generations, ensuring that knowledge of governance, ethics, and communal responsibility was not lost. This intergenerational dimension reinforced continuity and created a culture in which leadership was understood as service, education, and moral stewardship. Chiefs were, in essence, both political actors and educators, guiding their people not only through immediate decisions, but also by shaping the collective understanding of governance, law, and ethics. The external perception of Haudenosaunee leadership by Europeans provides further insight into its sophistication. Colonial leaders, traders, and diplomats often marveled at the organization, accountability, and deliberative rigor of the Confederacy. Figures like Benjamin Franklin noted, with both admiration and curiosity, the ability of the League to maintain unity, negotiate effectively, and resolve disputes without centralized coercion. These observations, while filtered through the lens of European assumptions, underscore the practical and intellectual achievement of Haudenosaunee leadership. The Confederacy offered a model in which ethical governance, procedural integrity, and strategic foresight were inseparable, producing a society capable of remarkable resilience and influence. Ultimately, the Haudenosaunee conception of leadership challenges conventional narratives of power and authority. Chiefs were not rulers in the sense of dominion or personal aggrandizement. They were responsible stewards of collective welfare, guided by ethics, accountable to the people, and reinforced by ceremonial and cultural norms. Their authority was conditional, relational, and moral, integrated with both internal governance and external diplomacy. This approach produced a stable, adaptable, and durable confederacy, one capable of navigating centuries of change while preserving its principles, unity, and legitimacy. By examining the Confederacy's approach to leadership, one begins to see the profound sophistication of the Haudenosaunee political system. The ethical, relational, and procedural dimensions of authority ensured that power was exercised responsibly, that disputes were resolved constructively, and that the Confederacy's principles endured across generations. Leadership was inseparable from accountability, morality, and foresight, a model of governance that anticipated many of the challenges and debates that would later shape American political thought. In this way, the Haudenosaunee not only governed effectively, but also left a legacy of political intelligence, ethical stewardship, and institutional resilience whose lessons resonate far beyond the forests of their homeland. When European explorers, traders, and settlers first arrived in the northeastern woodlands of North America, they encountered a social and political order unlike any they had previously known. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was already an established union of nations, operating with a level of sophistication and coherence that confounded outsiders accustomed to monarchies, feudal hierarchies, and nascent colonial assemblies. Early accounts reveal a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and misunderstanding. Europeans struggled to reconcile the independence of each nation with the unified authority of the Confederacy, to grasp how councils could achieve consensus without coercion, and to comprehend the moral and procedural rigor that guided decisions. To the colonists, the Haudenosaunee appeared at once orderly and strange, disciplined and egalitarian. Their political culture shaped by centuries of internal negotiation rather than the dictates of a king or distant parliament. Initial encounters were often transactional. Trade was the primary point of contact, as Europeans sought furs, food, and access to established networks, while the Haudenosaunee leveraged these relationships to acquire tools, weapons, and manufactured goods. Yet these transactions were never purely economic. They were deeply entwined with diplomacy and ceremony, with both sides recognizing the importance of protocol, negotiation, and trust. The Haudenosaunee demonstrated an acute awareness of European intentions and capabilities, approaching each interaction strategically, understanding the long-term implications of trade agreements, and ensuring that their sovereignty was neither compromised nor undermined. European observers, meanwhile, often interpreted these practices through their own cultural lens, failing to recognize that the Confederacy's methods of negotiation, alliance, and enforcement were rooted in an entirely different conception of authority, reciprocity, and law. The Europeans' first impressions were often filtered through a combination of fascination and ethnocentrism. Some chroniclers marveled at the ability of the Confederacy to maintain internal cohesion, noting that multiple nations could coordinate decisions without centralized coercion. Others, steeped in the assumption that hierarchical structures were the mark of civilization, dismissed the League's deliberative methods as inefficient or chaotic, failing to understand the depth of procedure, consensus building, and moral authority embedded in the councils. These initial misunderstandings would shape European attitudes for decades, influencing treaties, alliances, and the emerging colonial narrative, even as the Haudenosaunee continued to exercise political influence with remarkable skill and foresight. Diplomacy became the first arena in which the Haudenosaunee political sophistication was made visible to Europeans. Leaders from the Confederacy engaged with colonial officials not only as representatives of individual nations, but as spokespeople for a unified polity. Treaties were negotiated with care. Ceremonies reinforced the solemnity of agreements, and the principles of the Great Law of Peace governed both procedure and content. European negotiators were often struck by the precision, formality, and ethical expectations of these interactions. Promises were binding, commitments were taken seriously, and breaches carried both practical and moral consequences. In a world where European diplomacy could be driven by opportunism, deception, or the whims of powerful monarchs, the Haudenosaunee approach was both strikingly disciplined and strategically effective. Yet these encounters were not always understood in their full significance. Europeans often focused on material outcomes, trade goods, military alliances, or territorial concessions, while overlooking the broader implications of the Haudenosaunee political structures. The Confederacy's internal cohesion, its methods of consensus building, and the ethical dimensions of leadership were largely invisible to observers who prioritized European legal frameworks and hierarchical authority. Despite this, the Haudenosaunee were acutely aware of the power of their example. By demonstrating effective governance, ethical negotiation, and strategic unity, they shaped the perceptions, decisions, and sometimes the policy approaches of European settlers and colonial governments, even if such influence was rarely acknowledged explicitly. The first encounters also revealed the Haudenosaunee's capacity for strategic adaptation. They were not passive recipients of European influence. They actively managed interactions to protect their sovereignty, maintain balance among the nations, and advance collective interests. Negotiations were carefully calculated, and alliances were formed with a clear understanding of both immediate and long-term consequences. In conflicts between European powers, the Confederacy often positioned itself as a mediator, leveraging its diplomatic capital to secure advantages, protect territory, and maintain relative independence. These actions demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power, geography, and human motivation, challenging any notion that the Haudenosaunee were merely reactive or peripheral actors in the unfolding colonial landscape. Cultural misunderstanding was perhaps inevitable, given the profound differences in worldview, law, and governance. Europeans often failed to recognize the legitimacy of councils and consensus, interpreting procedural deliberation as weakness or indecision. They misread the role of clan mothers and other female leaders, assuming that power must be concentrated in the hands of men to be meaningful. These misinterpretations shaped subsequent policy, treaty negotiation, and historical narratives, obscuring the Confederacy's sophistication and reinforcing Eurocentric assumptions. Yet the Haudenosaunee navigated these misunderstandings with skill, leveraging their knowledge of European expectations to negotiate favorable outcomes, protect autonomy, and influence the broader colonial order. European observers who paid closer attention noted remarkable parallels between Haudenosaunee practices and the principles later associated with Western political thought. The emphasis on deliberation, accountability, and proportional response resembled aspects of Republican governance. The practice of mediating conflicts, distributing authority, and maintaining cohesion through persuasion and consensus mirrored emerging ideas about checks and balances. Figures like Benjamin Franklin and other colonial thinkers could see, at least partially, the functional and philosophical significance of these practices, even if their acknowledgement was filtered through a lens of cultural bias and selective admiration. The Confederacy's political system offered a working example of governance in which authority was constrained by law, ethics, and social accountability, a model that was observed, studied, and in subtle ways absorbed into the intellectual environment of the colonies. These encounters were further complicated by the pressures of European expansion and colonial rivalry. As settlers encroached on indigenous territories and competing European powers vied for influence, the Haudenosaunee were forced to navigate a precarious balance of diplomacy, alliance, and strategic neutrality. Leaders had to consider not only the immediate consequences of treaties or trade agreements, but also the long-term survival of their nations, the preservation of cultural autonomy, and the integrity of the Confederacy as a whole. The ability to manage these pressures while maintaining internal cohesion and moral authority exemplified the Confederacy's political sophistication. It also highlighted the contrast between European assumptions about hierarchy and conquest and the Haudenosaunee's commitment to ethical governance, negotiation, and foresight. Even as Europeans began to settle more permanently, the Confederacy's influence persisted. Through observation, engagement, and practical demonstration, the Haudenosaunee shaped colonial perceptions of unity, negotiation, and governance. Their councils, legal practices, and diplomatic strategies offered a model of political organization that emphasized deliberation, accountability, and ethical responsibility, concepts that would later resonate, in indirect ways, with colonial leaders seeking to unify disparate provinces into a functioning federation. Yet this influence was often unacknowledged, subsumed under Eurocentric narratives, and filtered through selective historical memory, leaving a gap between the reality of Haudenosaunee political achievement and its place in the dominant story of American history. The first encounters between Europeans and the Haudenosaunee thus represent more than mere curiosity or trade. They are a window into the transmission of ideas, the negotiation of sovereignty, and the subtle forms of influence that shaped the political imagination of the colonies. The Confederacy demonstrated that complex governance could be achieved without coercion, that unity could be sustained through dialogue, and that leadership could be ethical, accountable, and relational. These lessons were absorbed, consciously or unconsciously, by colonial thinkers, forming part of the intellectual ecosystem in which debates over union, governance, and the balance of power later took place. Ultimately, these early interactions underscore a broader theme. The Haudenosaunee were active participants in the shaping of the political landscape of North America, not passive observers or peripheral actors. Their ability to navigate complex social, cultural, and diplomatic challenges, to maintain cohesion across multiple nations, and to demonstrate the practical and ethical dimensions of governance, position them as influential players in the unfolding story of the continent. The first encounters set the stage for deeper engagement, reflection, and, in some cases, imitation, revealing a hidden architecture of political thought that would echo far beyond the forests and rivers of the northeastern woodlands. By understanding these interactions, one gains a richer appreciation of how indigenous governance and diplomacy contributed to the development of American political ideas, even as the explicit recognition of that influence remained limited. Diplomacy among the Haudenosaunee was not an occasional or ceremonial act. It was a daily practice, woven into the very fabric of political and social life. Every interaction with neighboring nations, trading partners, or European settlers carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Leaders approached diplomacy with careful calculation, weighing the needs of their own people, the demands of the Confederacy, and the unpredictable behaviors of outsiders. Treaties were not mere agreements. They were enduring commitments grounded in the ethical framework of the great law of peace. Promises were binding both morally and practically, and any violation could undermine the Confederacy's credibility and long-term security. In this environment, diplomacy was both a skill and a moral obligation, a constant balancing act between pragmatism and principle. The Haudenosaunee excelled in managing complexity. Each nation within the Confederacy retained sovereignty over its internal affairs, yet collective decisions were required in matters that affected the Confederacy as a whole, including foreign relations, trade, and conflict resolution. Diplomats, often chiefs or council representatives, had to navigate the competing interests of multiple nations, mediate disputes, and communicate outcomes with clarity and authority. Their work required patience, foresight, and a profound understanding of both human behavior and political dynamics. This was not a system dependent on force or intimidation. It relied on persuasion, reputation, and the ability to demonstrate the long-term benefits of cooperation. The Confederacy's sustained unity was in large part the result of this disciplined and principled approach to negotiation. European colonial governments quickly realized that they were dealing with a sophisticated political entity. Unlike many other indigenous groups they encountered, the Haudenosaunee had established norms, procedural rules, and ethical expectations that guided every interaction. Colonists who failed to adhere to these norms risked not only distrust, but tangible consequences, including the disruption of trade, the formation of alliances with rival powers, or military setbacks. The Haudenosaunee leveraged this awareness to assert agency, ensuring that engagement with Europeans did not compromise their autonomy. Their approach was neither confrontational nor subservient. It was strategic, deliberate, and highly effective, demonstrating a political acumen that often exceeded the understanding of their colonial counterparts. Daily diplomacy also encompassed intricate networks of communication, observation, and negotiation. Envoys and messengers were constantly in motion, relaying information between nations and maintaining relationships that spanned vast territories. These networks allowed the Haudenosaunee to monitor shifting alliances, anticipate potential threats, and respond to challenges with precision. Decisions were informed by a combination of immediate intelligence and long-term strategic thinking, reflecting a level of sophistication that allowed the Confederacy to navigate the complex geopolitical landscape of the 17th and 18th centuries. In contrast, European settlers, often preoccupied with immediate gains or colonial rivalries, sometimes underestimated the subtle power and coordination exercised by indigenous diplomats. The Haudenosaunee approach to diplomacy was inseparable from their internal political culture. Councils, clan mothers, and chiefs ensured that negotiations with outsiders were consistent with the Confederacy's values, laws, and long-term interests. Every treaty, alliance, or negotiation reflected both the ethical principles of the Great Law of Peace and the practical realities of maintaining unity across multiple nations. This integration of internal governance with external engagement created a coherence rarely observed in colonial administrations, allowing the Confederacy to exercise influence that extended far beyond its immediate borders. European observers, even when impressed, often failed to grasp the full significance of these practices, interpreting the results through the lens of European legal and political assumptions rather than recognizing them as expressions of indigenous political mastery. The Confederacy's diplomatic strategies were also proactive rather than reactive. Leaders anticipated potential threats, sought to prevent conflicts, and positioned the Haudenosaunee as arbiters in regional disputes. Their ability to act as mediators between European powers, other indigenous nations, and internation conflicts within the Confederacy itself demonstrated not only political skill but strategic foresight. These efforts were guided by an understanding of balance and reciprocity. Every decision was evaluated for its potential to enhance security, preserve autonomy, and maintain the moral authority of the Confederacy. Through this approach, the Haudenosaunee established themselves as indispensable actors in the regional political landscape, commanding respect and recognition from multiple parties even in the midst of colonial expansion. Trade, too, was a form of diplomacy. The exchange of goods, whether furs, tools, or weapons, was carefully managed to strengthen relationships, secure strategic advantages, and maintain interdependence. Negotiation over trade was not limited to immediate material gain. It was an opportunity to reinforce alliances, demonstrate reliability and cultivate influence. European traders often found themselves learning, sometimes inadvertently, the principles of negotiation and accountability embedded within Haudenosaunee practices. These economic interactions were therefore inseparable from political strategy, further illustrating the Confederacy's integrated approach to governance and diplomacy. Observation and adaptation were central to this diplomatic practice. The Haudenosaunee were keenly aware of European political dynamics, recognizing shifts in power, competing interests, and cultural expectations. They adjusted their strategies accordingly, using knowledge of European priorities to shape treaties, alliances, and negotiations in ways that protected their interests. At the same time, they remained vigilant about internal cohesion, ensuring that external engagements did not disrupt the delicate balance between the Confederacy's nations. This dual focus, simultaneously managing internal politics and external relations, was a hallmark of Haudenosaunee diplomacy, requiring skill, patience, and a profound understanding of both human behavior and the broader strategic landscape. European recognition of Haudenosaunee diplomatic skill was inconsistent but notable. Colonial leaders who engaged seriously with the Confederacy were often impressed by the clarity, consistency, and moral authority of its representatives. Treaties that would have been fraught with misunderstanding in other contexts were negotiated with precision, ceremonial oversight, and ethical constraint. Even when European powers attempted to exploit divisions or assert dominance, the Haudenosaunee maintained a level of cohesion and strategic leverage that repeatedly surprised outsiders. This ability to navigate a complex colonial environment while preserving autonomy, authority, and ethical governance underscores the sophistication and effectiveness of their daily diplomatic practice. The Haudenosaunee approach to diplomacy also influenced European thought in subtle but enduring ways. Observers noted that the Confederacy could maintain unity across multiple autonomous nations, resolve disputes without coercion, and enforce agreements through moral authority rather than brute force. Figures like Benjamin Franklin would later reflect on these qualities, drawing lessons from indigenous governance in considering how colonies might cooperate, resolve disputes, and structure collective decision-making. Though these lessons were rarely explicitly acknowledged, the Haudenosaunee model provided a real-world example of deliberative governance, ethical leadership, and strategic foresight that would inform the broader intellectual environment in which the United States was conceived. Ultimately, the Haudenosaunee demonstrated that diplomacy was not a secondary skill or a reactive response. It was central to governance, survival, and influence. Their daily practice of negotiation, observation, and strategic engagement allowed them to navigate the complex pressures of colonial expansion while preserving their sovereignty and cohesion. The Confederacy's leaders acted with foresight, integrity, and relational awareness, ensuring that every interaction, whether with a neighboring nation or a European diplomat, was informed by both principle and practicality. In doing so, they established a model of diplomacy that was proactive, ethical, and remarkably effective, leaving an imprint on the colonial imagination and subtly shaping the political consciousness of the emerging United States. Through this lens, diplomacy among the Haudenosaunee was both a political and moral exercise, inseparable from internal governance and collective identity. It was a continuous, deliberate practice that reinforced the Confederacy's stability, expanded its influence, and demonstrated the enduring power of ethical leadership. By observing, engaging with, and adapting to the complex web of colonial and international relations, the Haudenosaunee not only preserved their sovereignty, but offered an enduring example of how diplomacy, grounded in law, ethics, and relational responsibility, can serve as the backbone of a resilient and influential political system. As colonial settlements expanded and intercolonial cooperation became a pressing concern, some European observers began to recognize the Haudenosaunee Confederacy not merely as a distant curiosity, but as a functional model of political unity. Among them, Benjamin Franklin stands out as a figure who, through his writings and correspondence, reflected upon the Confederacy's capacity to maintain cohesion among diverse nations. Franklin and other colonial leaders were grappling with a challenge that was, in essence, a scaled-down version of the problem the Haudenosaunee had already solved: how to unite semi-autonomous entities under a cooperative framework without sacrificing the autonomy or authority of individual members. The lessons embedded in the Haudenosaunee system were practical, observable, and historically grounded, yet they were filtered through layers of cultural bias, admiration, and selective interpretation. Franklin's observations reveal a deep awareness of the Confederacy's methods and principles. He noted that the Haudenosaunee could maintain consensus across multiple nations, implement laws that regulated both internal and external affairs, and ensure accountability through established procedures rather than coercive power. These qualities were striking to Franklin because they demonstrated a functioning model of federalism long before the colonies themselves had formalized any comparable system. The Confederacy balanced local autonomy with collective responsibility, enforced rules through ethical and procedural norms, and maintained internal cohesion through dialogue, negotiation, and structured oversight. Franklin's recognition of these practices illustrates that the Haudenosaunee were not passive observers of European colonization, but active exemplars of governance whose strategies offered lessons for emergent political systems. The influence of the Haudenosaunee on Franklin's thinking is most evident in his advocacy for colonial unity during the mid-18th century. In his writings and speeches, he repeatedly emphasized the need for the colonies to coordinate decisions, resolve disputes, and act collectively while respecting the independence of each province. These reflections bear remarkable parallels to the Confederacy's model: councils that deliberate, leaders who negotiate and compromise, and decisions that emerge from consensus rather than imposition. While Franklin's use of indigenous examples was selective and filtered through a European lens, the essential insight remains clear. The Haudenosaunee offered a living proof that a union of semi-autonomous entities could function effectively, sustainably, and ethically. Other colonial leaders and observers noted similar patterns. Diplomatic correspondence, trade negotiations, and military alliances frequently highlighted the Confederacy's ability to coordinate multiple nations, maintain internal discipline, and respond strategically to external threats. Colonial governments, facing the reality of intercolonial rivalries, geographic dispersion, and competing European powers, observed the practical advantages of a system in which unity was negotiated, authority was conditional, and accountability was embedded in law and custom. These observers, while often constrained by ethnocentric assumptions, could not entirely ignore the efficacy of the Haudenosaunee approach, which combined moral authority with operational efficiency. The Confederacy's influence extended beyond abstract principles into concrete applications. Franklin and others studied the Haudenosaunee practice of council representation, noting the advantages of deliberation, proportionality, and consultation. They observed the mechanisms by which leaders were held accountable, removed when necessary, and guided by ethical frameworks rather than personal ambition. These lessons were integrated into discussions about colonial governance, federation, and the negotiation of competing interests among provinces. In essence, the Haudenosaunee offered a proof of concept. Unity could be achieved without coercion, authority could be distributed without chaos, and governance could be principled, sustainable, and adaptive. Despite this recognition, the Haudenosaunee contribution remained largely unacknowledged in official historical narratives. The model they provided, observable, effective, and morally grounded, was filtered through European interpretations and often minimized or appropriated without explicit credit. Yet the subtle traces of influence are unmistakable. Ideas about federalism, checks and balances, deliberative councils, and conditional authority resonate strongly with the Confederacy's practices. The alignment between these concepts and later colonial debates suggests that indigenous governance shaped, in practical and philosophical ways, the emerging understanding of collective governance in North America. The Confederacy's example challenged assumptions about the origins of democratic thought, demonstrating that political innovation was not the exclusive province of European theory, but could also emerge from centuries of lived practice and institutional refinement. The Confederacy's ethical and procedural rigor was particularly influential. Franklin noted the Haudenosaunee's insistence that leaders act in the interest of the collective, respect precedents, and resolve disputes without resorting to coercion. These principles mirrored the colonial desire to create a system in which provinces could negotiate authority, enforce law, and maintain unity without centralized tyranny. The Haudenosaunee approach demonstrated that the stability of a union depended on accountability, procedural integrity, and the internalization of shared values. In this sense, their influence was not abstract. It was concrete, observed, and operational, providing a template for colonial thinkers to consider how independent entities might cooperate for mutual benefit. Military alliances further highlighted the Confederacy's capacity to shape colonial thinking. The Haudenosaunee were often sought as allies in conflicts between European powers, yet their participation was guided by strategic calculation and adherence to principle rather than submission. Their ability to negotiate terms, maintain cohesion, and leverage their position for long-term advantage demonstrated to colonial leaders the practical benefits of disciplined, ethically grounded governance. Franklin and others observed that a union that could manage internal consensus and exercise influence externally would be far more resilient than one dependent on hierarchical authority or coercion alone. These observations contributed to evolving discussions about collective action, shared sovereignty, and the balance between autonomy and coordination. The intellectual and practical lessons of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy were not universally appreciated, yet they persisted in the colonial imagination. Franklin's use of indigenous examples was often rhetorical, serving to illustrate points about unity and governance. Yet the underlying principle was clear. The Confederacy offered a working demonstration of principles that colonists struggled to implement in practice. Councils that deliberated, leaders held accountable, and decisions grounded in ethical frameworks provided an observable model of governance that could inform debates about colonial federation, the resolution of disputes, and the creation of durable institutions. In effect, the Haudenosaunee demonstrated that effective political organization was possible without centralized coercion, authoritarian rule, or the suppression of diversity. These observations were not limited to Franklin alone. Other colonial thinkers, diplomats, and officials recognized the practical efficacy of the Confederacy's system. Reports, letters, and negotiations frequently commented on the sophistication of council deliberation, the ethical responsibilities of leaders, and the Confederacy's ability to maintain unity across multiple autonomous nations. Even when these lessons were filtered through European assumptions or selectively applied, they provided a conceptual foundation that would influence discussions of federation, collective decision-making, and the balance of power among the colonies. The Confederacy's example illustrated that unity, accountability, and ethical governance were achievable, providing both a practical and philosophical model for political organization. Ultimately, the Haudenosaunee's impact on Franklin and other colonial leaders underscores a broader truth. The origins of American political thought were not exclusively European. The Confederacy offered a living example of governance, law, and diplomacy that demonstrated how diverse entities could cooperate, maintain autonomy, and exercise ethical leadership. This influence, though subtle and often unacknowledged, resonates through the principles of federalism, checks and balances, and deliberative governance that became central to the United States. By observing, reflecting upon, and, in some cases, adapting these practices, colonial thinkers were exposed to ideas that were practical, tested, and morally grounded, concepts that have been functioning successfully in the northeastern woodlands for centuries. In recognizing this influence, one begins to appreciate the Haudenosaunee not merely as historical actors, but as architects of political ideas whose lessons extended far beyond their immediate context. Their councils, leadership structures, and diplomatic strategies provided a model for uniting autonomous entities in a way that balanced power, ethics, and practicality. Franklin's reflections, along with those of other colonial observers, reveal that indigenous governance was neither incidental nor peripheral. It was an active source of insight, demonstrating the efficacy of consensus, accountability, and principled leadership. By situating the Haudenosaunee within the intellectual and practical currents of the colonial period, one gains a richer understanding of the hidden foundations of American political thought and the enduring relevance of indigenous political wisdom. As colonial leaders grappled with the challenge of uniting disparate provinces, the example of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy became increasingly relevant, even if not always explicitly acknowledged. The Confederacy offered a practical demonstration of principles that colonial thinkers were struggling to articulate: how independent political entities could cooperate for mutual benefit, resolve disputes without coercion, and maintain unity across a diverse and decentralized population. Observers noted the Confederacy's councils, its system of proportional representation, and the conditional authority of its leaders, recognizing that these mechanisms allowed multiple nations to coordinate decisions without sacrificing autonomy. For colonial leaders facing the persistent tensions between provinces with divergent interests, these examples provided a template for imagining a federation grounded in negotiation, compromise, and ethical governance rather than coercion or unilateral authority. Debates over colonial union were intense and complex. Some leaders favored strong, centralized authority, arguing that uniform policies and enforcement mechanisms were essential for defense, trade, and diplomacy. Others, influenced consciously or unconsciously by indigenous practices, recognized the value of preserving provincial autonomy while creating mechanisms for cooperation. The Haudenosaunee model demonstrated that a system could exist in which local independence and collective responsibility were balanced effectively, providing insight into how councils, deliberation, and consensus could function in practice. This offered colonial thinkers a concrete example of governance that did not rely on coercion or hierarchical imposition, showing that distributed authority, when coupled with ethical oversight and procedural rigor, could produce stability and coordination over large and diverse territories. The principle of consensus, so central to the Haudenosaunee councils, resonated particularly strongly in these debates. Colonial assemblies often struggled with disputes that threatened to paralyze decision-making or provoke conflict between provinces. By observing the Confederacy's deliberative process, in which multiple representatives from each nation were empowered to speak, negotiate, and shape outcomes, colonial thinkers began to consider ways to structure intercolonial councils so that all parties could have a meaningful voice. This emphasis on proportional representation, dialogue, and compromise provided a conceptual bridge between the practical successes of the Haudenosaunee and the emerging political theory of federation, illustrating that unity could be negotiated rather than imposed, and that power could be distributed without resulting in chaos or disunity. Another aspect of Haudenosaunee governance that influenced colonial thought was the conditional and accountable nature of leadership. Chiefs were entrusted with authority, but that authority was contingent upon their adherence to ethical principles and the welfare of the collective. They could be removed if they acted contrary to the interests of the people or the Confederacy, ensuring that power was exercised responsibly. For colonial leaders, this concept offered a model for checks and balances, accountability mechanisms, and the ethical distribution of authority, demonstrating that governance could be both stable and flexible. The Confederacy illustrated that a system could function effectively without concentrating power in a single ruler or institution, providing a practical precedent for the creation of institutions designed to balance authority, protect autonomy, and preserve cohesion.